Hello, everyone. Jeff Gianola, and I think you're going to enjoy my guest. We're going to be talking about an incident that happened here in Portland on December 28th, 1978. United Flight 173 went down in an East Burnside neighborhood. My guest today is a doctor, a trauma and emergency room doctor. He is also a trial attorney, and he was the first doctor on the scene when the United plane went down in East Burnside in that neighborhood. I want you to meet my good friend, Dr. Paul Blaylock. And Paul, it's great to have you here with me. I could do a whole interview just talking about your amazing career, but take me back, Paul, to that evening of December 28th, 1978, when United Flight 173 went down. It essentially ran out of gas, and we'll be talking more about that. But you had a unique position back then as a doctor concerning Multnomah County. Talk about that.
Yeah. Let me set the table for that day a little bit. I was chairman of the Multnomah County Medical Society's Disaster Committee. I had served on the committee a few years before I became chairman. And I had a beeper. We didn't have cell phones. And I had a beeper. So December 28th was an interesting event in my life, and I remember it like it was yesterday because of the uniqueness of that day. I had worked all night the previous night in the emergency room, 12-hour shift. 78, I would have been a Good Sam. And then the next day, I had gone to my neuro office in Hillsborough, and I'd worked all day in the neuro office. So I really hadn't really been asleep for about 28 hours. I got home to my newlywed wife. We had gotten married on a date, you can't forget your anniversary. We got married on 7/8/78, July 8th, 78. And my wife was a flight attendant for American Airlines. And we met in Houston when I was doing my training under DeBakey in Blaylock. I got home, and she prepared a nice, she was Sicilian, she prepared a nice Sicilian dinner. And my beeper went off at 6:06 p.m. And it was my emergency beeper. And so I called in to the exchange, and they said, you need to rush to Portland International Airport. United Airlines is in trouble and probably going to have a crash landing at the airport. So we both jumped into my 1977 Tennessee Orange Jeep and Cherokee, and we took off down from Rock Creek Country Club.
Now, Paul, you have told me this is a story really of serendipity and circumstances. You had some supplies in your Jeep that you normally wouldn't have had. Tell me about that.
On December 26th, day after Christmas, I had written my year-end report for the Disaster Committee that basically, in a nutshell, it said we did our 2 drills that we normally did. The last drill we did was at the airport, which was our most common site where we do a disaster drill. And I wrote a report that said we had no disasters. So I still had in the back of my Jeep this bag. And in this bag was my disaster kit, which included some gauze and first aid stuff. But more importantly, it included our code cards, color-coded. If there were a disaster, you would tag when you triage patients with a color code. For example, if they died, they get a black tag. And if they're the walking the walking very minor injury, they get a white tag. If they're yellow, it means they have some injury but not critical. If they're red, they're most critical and have got to be transported to the nearest trauma center.
And circumstances were, because of that training that you had, that was already loaded in your Jeep when you were taking off to the accident scene.
That was amazing that I still, because I didn't always carry this bag around in my car. I was I was not going to, I had asked not to be chairman of the disaster committee for the next year, and I was going to be turning this bag over to somebody else. And that hadn't happened yet, and I needed what I had.
So you're on your way there, and then your beeper goes off again?
Just before I got to the Sunset Tunnel on I-26, Sunset Highway, my beeper goes off again, and alerted a digital on the beeper, because we didn't have a cell phone. Said plane didn't make it, crashed East Burnside, and gave me an address.
Wow.
So we are going code 3 speed, as fast as I could drive safely down East Burnside till we came to the site of the crash, and there were power lines down everywhere. And I'm driving over these power lines. Thank God, apparently none of them were live, because the circuit breakers, when they hit the power lines. I get to the scene, which was very eerie. It's December, and of course now it's 6:20, 6:25, 6:30-ish. It's dark. And when I got there were only a very few other people around, and one of the groups that happened to be there, I pulled my Jeep up as close to the plane. Because they had no gas, there was no explosion.
Yeah, the plane basically, we'll talk about this, but the
Yeah.
plane basically, he glided that on top of this neighborhood between the trees, and I think took out 2 unoccupied houses, which was it's amazing that no one on the ground was killed. But when you arrived on the scene, there's no fuel smell and there's no fire because the plane essentially was out of gas.
That's right.
And then what did you do immediately? I'm sure you went to the place where you saw the most damage on the plane. I understand the cockpit was intact, but where first class was, that's where everything broke apart, and is that where the fatalities were? 10 people died in this accident.
Yeah, they had moved in the procedure. I think this would be a good point to tell you how this plane ended up in the circumstances. They were going to land from Denver, and the landing gear light showed that the landing gear did not come down. And if it did come down, it didn't lock. So they did a flyover to see if the tower could visualize whether or not the landing gear was down. And my recollection was the tower said, we see the landing gear, but we don't know if it's locked. We don't know if it's in place. We can't tell. So Captain McBroom, at that time, this airplane had 3 pilots.
And the main pilot was a man named Captain Malburn McBroom.
That's correct. And he was a seasoned, very qualified pilot.
I think he'd worked for United for something like 27 years.
Something like that.
So he starts doing the procedural things like dumping fuel as he's circling, right?
He relied on his third officer, which is the engineer on a plane. Back then it was a pilot, co-pilot, and an engineer. The engineer was in charge of communications and gauges and so forth. And the engineer, they were going to do 2.5 circles to dump all the fuel. Later, we found out through discovery and research that the fuel gauge was defective.
And United knew it was defective.
And United knew that this gauge was having some problems with some of their planes in advance.
So McBroom, basically, the engine starts sputtering out, and he literally glides this DC-8 into the darkest place he sees, which is a neighborhood off of East Burnside, 157th, and he basically kind of lands in a clump of trees, takes out 2 unoccupied houses, but he basically landed in the trees.
Captain McBroom saved 176 lives that night.
Yeah, 176 survived, 10 die, and roughly 24 injured in that. What goes through your mind when you arrive there? Do you immediately start, where did you go? I mean, how do you know how to assess a situation like that?
Well, I was a fairly experienced ER doctor by that time, and I only had one access to inside the plane, and that was where it broke apart back behind the captain, the main cabin, and all 10 that died were in first class. They had moved a couple of mothers with their handheld babies up to first class.
I think 4 children died in this accident among the 10 fatalities.
And they all died.
Yeah.
And the flight attendant, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2, they died. Captain McBroom and the co-pilot survived. The engineer, the third pilot, was killed.
So do you immediately go to where the most trauma is and the fatalities?
Yes, I went to that part of the plane because I didn't see the raft type airbags that come out of the exits where people were starting to climb out of the plane. Most people were climbing out of the plane from the front where it was broken in 2 and not through the exits. Finally, I had no other doctors there. I had no ambulance there immediately. I had an ambulance there about 15, 18 minutes after I got there, and we set up a triage station, and they were in charge of communicating with a designated trauma hospital, which was Prague, Portland. And Prague, Portland would triage according to how I classified each passenger with my tags. The red tags, the people that were the most injured, would go to the 2 trauma centers, Manual and OHSU. The yellow tags, which have injuries that need to be treated, would go to the level 2 hospitals in the city. And Prague, Portland controlled all that, where the ambulances would go. We had all 176 survivors in an emergency room, hospital setting in less than an hour and a half, which was pretty amazing.
I think later the FAA sort of recognized you for your work that evening in your response to that accident.
I went to San Francisco to a disaster conference and by invitation, and they recognized me with a FAA citation for saving lives and triaging a major disaster. It was, as I recall, it was the first time a major airline had crashed that only those that died on impact, that 100% survived and did not die later.
I asked you this question before we started. You know, we talk about PTSD, and you arriving on a scene like that. You have death, you have survivors. I mean, you're seeing things, and you said, really, it was your training that pays off. That I'm not saying you're immune to it, but you're trained to deal with it.
Well, unfortunately, I shouldn't have taken my wife, the flight attendant, American Airlines, with me. Once I pulled out the first dead stewardess, they were known as stewardesses back then, I had to send her back to the Jeep. It was emotionally very traumatic for her. But for me, I trained at Ben Taub, which was the 3rd busiest ER in the United States in Houston, Texas. And I was in Dr. Michael DeBakey's program, a very famous surgeon. Uh, we see this. Any trauma center like Emmanuel and OHSU, we see trauma disasters all on a regular basis. So no, it doesn't affect me. In fact, I find it most exciting treating these kinds of situations, because what we do as ER doctors in the first 30 minutes makes a difference for many of them, whether or not they live or die.
This was both a tragedy and a miracle. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. It was a miracle, but it was also a man-made miracle. Captain McBroom looked for the darkest place he could put a gliding airliner down, and he only had the access to flaps, which would influence how far and how he would be able to glide an empty plane.
Well, let's talk about Captain McBroom. This was devastating to his life. Here he had been an experienced pilot, worked for United Airlines, I think 27 years, and of course, he never flew again after this. And this really, a lot of folks initially blamed him for this accident, and yet 20 years later, they have a reunion, and we're looking at video of that right now. And Captain McBroom decides to come, and he is stunned when they give him a standing ovation, and those survivors say, he saved lives. I mean, United knew that fuel gauge was faulty. You know, they had a problem. He did the best he can, and yet it really kind of destroyed his life, didn't it, Paul?
Yeah, it did. I understand. He has since died, but I understand that once United grounded him and terminated him, he never flew again, and that he became an alcoholic. That's hearsay, but that's my understanding from several sources. But you have to understand, the public never knew about the fuel gauge. All they know is the pilot crashed his airplane. Yeah. And so the reality of the facts of the situation, but from the very first interview, and I'd love to talk about Channel 2 and their camera lights when I got there.
Yeah, Channel 2 was the first television crew on scene, and that was sort of vital because you used their camera lights, which were very strong at the time, right?
Yes, all I had was my headlights on my Jeep, which I was parked about 30 yards from the plane, and I had my headlights on, shining towards the plane. But Channel 2 got there, and they had their lights on, and so I'm pulling bodies out of the plane, and I look over at Channel 2's lights, and I saw the red light. I'd done TV interviews before, and I said, no, you can't film this. This is not for live television. And I said, I'll give you the first interview, but turn your cameras off and give me the lights. And so without their lights, I would have had very difficult in the darkness there of being able to do what I was doing. By then, I started having lots of people getting out of the plane, and I was getting, 20, 30 ambulances responding. I still didn't have a doctor.
Well, it's hard for folks to remember. Now we think, well, there'd be incidents. There were no cell phones then.
No.
I mean, cell phones have revolutionized everything. It's instantaneous. There's communication. There's planning. So it took a while for the help to arrive.
It did. And I didn't have additional doctors. I had paramedics, which are very good, very trained. And then I had a lot of volunteers that were there, firemen, police, that helped assist getting people off the plane and to the ambulances. And I had to set up a morgue by law. And so we used this lady's front yard. She's standing on the porch, and we're putting dead bodies in her front yard. I don't remember her name. And because I didn't have a coroner.
Yeah. This accident then, this changes, you look at this ends up changing sort of policies when it comes to disasters, how the county was handling it. And at the airline industry, there were major changes made in how crews communicate in the cockpit, right?
That's correct. There were a lot of changes after this crash, and that was one of the discussions that in San Francisco. You may not remember, but San Francisco San Diego, which was one of the most dangerous airports in America for a lot of reasons.
That crash had happened. That was the
Pretty
PSA
close.
flight just a few months before the December crash here in Portland.
That's my recollection is
Yeah.
the San Diego crash, which killed everybody, and it landed in the edge of the city, which you fly very low into the San Diego airport to get to the over buildings. Anyway, it changed a lot of things. Number one, with time and discovery through the litigations, the lawsuits against United Airlines, and then we came to find out that the cause of the crash was they made one half circle too many dumping fuel due to a faulty gas gauge, and that was the cause of the crash.
It is a shame about Captain McBroom because he did take so much of the initial blame, and that's a tragedy in itself, and how he led his life. But for him, I think there was that redemption moment when he did go to that reunion, don't you think?
Oh, there's no question about it. And he was a very nice man to me because he knew that I was interviewed immediately with Channel 2, and that's a funny story, and I'll do it politely. And then I gave more interviews with your station and NBC locally, and then the next morning I was written up in the Oregonian. I gave interviews for them and then other interviews. But Captain McBroom thanked me because I said from the beginning, from the very first interview, that this captain saved a lot of lives by putting this plane down in a dark area.
Well, you mentioned it briefly, and if there's a moment of sort of some ironic humor in this whole thing, it's when the reporter started to interview you, and it centers around the word triage. Tell me about that.
So, as promised, 2 hours later, after we'd gotten everybody away from the scene and the scene was stabilized, as promised, I gave Channel 2 the first interview. I won't say the gender, and I won't say who it was, but the very first question was, so Dr. Blaylock, I heard you using the word triage a lot as you were moving bodies around and tagging them with the tags and so forth. If the plane hadn't landed in the trees, would you still be using the word triage? I paused and took a very high road in saying the plane landing in the trees has nothing to do with triage. Triage is a Greek word. It means to sort, to prioritize. It's to evaluate in the order of severity, but it has nothing to do with landing in the trees. And I remember all my professional colleagues, ER doctors from all over the city, said, "Boy, Paul, you were sure nice. You were sure nice to that reporter." And I said, "Well."
Let's talk about emergency room doctors. You told me something that I was not aware of. You said emergency room medicine really, in doctors, really that came about in the mid-'70s, that before that, doctors were just on rotation. They'd work in the emergency room, but specially trained emergency room doctors. And you were part of that first group here in Portland, right?
I was. There were emergency medicine didn't exist until 1974, which is 4 years prior to this crash. And the first residencies really weren't established until 1975. So there was no such thing as a board-certified ER doctor. Emergency rooms like at Good Sam and all the hospitals, whoever was on the medical staff had to do their rotations through the emergency room, and regardless of specialty. So you might get an internist, you might get a surgeon, you might get an orthopedist, you might, hopefully you didn't get a, no disrespect to dermatology or pathology, but that's not who you want to be taking care of a heart attack. But yeah, it was a rotational situation. So at Good Sam, I was part of the very first full-time ER doctors. We had 4. You worked 12-hour shifts. We didn't have any backups. It was only 4 of us. And 2 of us worked 12-hour night shifts, and 2 of us worked 12-hour day shifts. And I was the night shift doctor because I had another practice. I had a neuro practice in Hillsboro. And I hadn't gone to law school yet, so I only had 2 professions going at once.
You know, we have about 5 minutes left here, and I did want to mention that I could have you back as a guest, and we could just talk about your life in general. But you not only are a doctor of medicine who's still practicing after how many years? More than 50 years. And you
years.
also decided after you got your medical degree to get your law degree. And I don't think there's too many lawyer doctors out there, are there?
No. As far as I know, there's very few in the country at the time that were actually a full-time doctor and a full-time trial lawyer. I was at Miller Nash Law Firm after law school.
Here in Portland.
Here in Portland.
Yeah, they were located, I remember, in the Big Pink building at the time.
We were in Big Pink, 1984, when I graduated. And
you were actually a trial attorney, right?
Yes, I was. I defended doctors. Within 2 years, I started out doing asbestos defense because I was the only doctor on asbestos defense. Everywhere I went was 22 lawyers representing 22 companies. And but within 2 years, I had built up my own private clientele of doctors, and I represented defense doctors, and we were Providence Hospital's lawyers.
Well,
so,
I find this fascinating. Were there times where you would be in your hospital gear and have to change into a suit to be an attorney for, and when did you sleep?
Well, I've been blessed. My parents could never get me to go to bed as a child. I'm a 5-hour-a-nighter.
Wow.
Now that I'm older, I'm a 6-hour-a-nighter.
Okay, you moved it up an hour. Okay.
I didn't have to, but I did. But I would wear a 3-piece pinstripe suit. Every time I see a Superman movie, I always think of myself. I would wear a 3-piece pinstripe suit until about 4 p.m. every day at Miller Nash in the U.S. Bank Tower, and then I'd change into my scrubs, and I went across the river, and I did level 1 ER trauma at Emmanuel until 3 a.m. When I got off my shift and dictated 40, 50 charts, get back to my Miller Nash office, and I had a recliner chair, and I would sleep 3 hours, 4 hours, and shower, and practice law again all day.
Paul, it's been amazing talking to you, and I do want to have you back just to talk about how you were raised in the South, sharecropper parents, your love of reading, and how you've always worked to better yourself, and just your zest for life, which still reflects right now, on how you're saying just grab every day and squeeze the heck out of it, That's sort of your philosophy, isn't it?
Henry David Thoreau was kind of an icon, inspiration that I met him in college.
Wow.
In spirit. And he said, suck the marrow out of life every day. And that was one of his many quotations that I've kind of lived my life by. It's a blessing and a gift to be able to make a difference in people's lives all these years. I'm not practicing full-time medicine anymore. I just do mostly medical legal consultations, but it's a gift.
Well, we were all blessed that you were on the scene that day back in December 28th, 1978, when the United Airlines flight went down. You're part of Portland's history, as that tragedy is. But it's also a miracle, and partly because you were on the scene that day. So, Paul, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope everyone enjoyed our visit here with Dr. Paul Blaylock, and I am going to have Paul back because the story of his life is absolutely fascinating. I think we'll all get something out of that. Paul, thank you so much for being here.
That day ended. I came home to Rock Creek Country Club, where I've lived for the last 49 years, and on my front door were notes. I was fairly new to the neighborhood. I bought my home there in '75, and on my door were notes from these little children in my neighborhood that said, "You are our hero, and we're so glad you live on our street." And I had little flowers and little mementos from these kids, and
That's
that was
pretty
a
awesome.
great way to end the day.
It's a great way to end this little talk, too. Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.